There were scuff marks on the hallway floor, not random marks, not the kind left by furniture being rearranged or a box being dragged across the room. These were directional, measured, nearly 6 feet in length. And when investigators looked at them carefully, really looked at them, they understood something that changed everything about this case. Those marks were not made by something being moved. They were made by someone. An 84-year-old woman had vanished from her home without her car, without her purse, without her phone. No forced entry, no explanation, just absence. And 6 feet of evidence on a hallway floor that told a story no one in that house wanted told. What happened to Nancy Guthrie did not begin with a dramatic moment. It did not begin with a chase or a struggle visible to the outside world. It began quietly, inside a home, between people who knew each other, and it ended with a federal investigation, a confession, and a verdict. This is that story. From the beginning. If you are watching this for the first time, welcome to True Crime Files. This channel covers cases that matter, not for the drama, but for the truth behind them. If this kind of in-depth storytelling is what you are looking for, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. There is a particular kind of alarm that comes not from something happening, but from something stopping. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She was a woman defined by consistency, by routines that held, by plans that were kept, by contact that was maintained with the people in her life who expected to hear from her. She was not a woman who went quiet without reason. She was not a woman who disappeared into her own silence. She had a life that moved with a kind of predictable, steady rhythm that people build over decades, and the people who loved her knew that rhythm well enough to know immediately when it stopped. And it stopped completely on the day she vanished. The first signs were not dramatic. They rarely are. Someone reached out and heard nothing back. Then someone else did the same. The calls went unanswered. The messages sat unread. And in that particular, creeping way, that alarm grows when you cannot immediately explain it. The people around Nancy Guthrie began to understand that something was wrong. What they found when they looked for her made that understanding permanent. Her car was still in the driveway. Her purse was still inside the house. Her phone had not moved. These 3 facts, taken individually, might each carry a benign explanation. Taken together, they carry only one conclusion. People who leave of their own will take their things. They take their keys. They take the device that connects them to the world. They take the bag that holds the practical pieces of their daily life. Nancy Guthrie left none of it behind, which meant Nancy Guthrie did not leave. Something else happened. The missing persons report was filed, and investigators arrived at the house with the trained awareness that separates professional observation from ordinary concern. They were not there to be reassured. They were there to understand, and what they found inside that house gave them something to work with, though not in the way anyone hoped. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered window frames, no evidence of a stranger pushing their way in from the outside. The doors had been opened from within, or by someone who already had access. That single detail eliminated randomness from the equation entirely. Whatever had happened here was not the work of an unknown person passing through. This was connection. This was proximity. This was someone Nancy Guthrie knew. And then they found the marks. The hallway floor held them like a record. Directional scuff marks, not scattered, not overlapping in the chaotic way that accident leaves evidence, but linear, measured, nearly 6 feet in length, running in a single direction. Investigators measured them. They studied the angle and the depth and the path. They considered what kind of force, what kind of movement, would leave that particular pattern on that particular surface. And what they concluded was not comfortable, but it was clear. Those marks were consistent with a body being moved, not with a fall, not with an accident, not with someone stumbling or dropping something heavy. They were consistent with deliberate movement, with someone being taken from one place and transferred to another, along a hallway, through a home, by hands that were making a decision in real time. That conclusion changed the investigation entirely. A missing person case carries its own weight. But once physical evidence suggests that a person did not leave but was moved, the case transforms. It is no longer about finding someone who walked away. It is about understanding an event that occurred within those walls. Events have causes. Causes have people behind them. And people leave traces, sometimes digital, sometimes physical, sometimes both. Investigators began building the timeline from that moment. And the timeline, as it developed, pointed in one direction. In any investigation involving a missing person, there is a hierarchy of relevance, not of guilt. Relevance. The people closest to the final known moment carry the most important timelines because their accounts, if accurate, illuminate what happened, and when, if inaccurate, they reveal something equally important, the shape of a lie. Tomasso Caione was Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law. He was connected to her through family, through marriage, through the kind of relationship that grants access to a home, to a schedule, to the trust of someone who had no reason to be guarded around him. He was not a stranger on the periphery of Nancy's life. He was inside it. And on the day she disappeared, he was the last known person to see her alive. That fact alone does not imply guilt. Investigators understand this. The last person to see someone alive is often the first person to provide crucial information. Information that can lead to answers, that can illuminate a timeline, that can help locate someone who is missing. Proximity is not accusation. It is starting point. But Tomasso's account had problems. He told investigators that Nancy had seemed fine when he last saw her, that she had mentioned going out, that nothing unusual had happened during their time together. He presented this account with composure, with the measured calm of someone who had prepared what they were going to say. On the surface, it was a reasonable statement, the kind of account that, if verifiable, would have moved the investigation in a different direction. The problem was that it was not verifiable, not the way he described it. Investigators began cross-referencing his stated timeline against the digital record. Cell phones, in the modern era, are among the most reliable witnesses available to law enforcement. They record movement. They record location. They record the path a person took and the time they took it, without interpretation, without emotion, without the ability to construct a narrative around what they observed. They simply record. And what Tomasso's phone recorded contradicted what he told investigators. His device showed movement, not small movement, not the minor variation that could be explained by a phone sitting near a window or picking up a distant tower, but significant deliberate movement, nearly 15 miles from the house, during the same window of time when he had explicitly told police that he had never left. 15 miles is not a memory lapse. It is not the kind of discrepancy that arises from confusion about what time something happened or whether someone stepped outside briefly. 15 miles is a destination. 15 miles means a choice was made, a vehicle was entered, a route was driven, and a place was reached. And then a decision was made to say none of that occurred. That contradiction became the first structural break in his account. Investigators did not announce it immediately. That is not how evidence is used most effectively. Instead, they continued building the picture quietly, layer by layer, adding physical evidence to digital evidence, adding observation to data, adding weight to weight until the structure could not be ignored. At the secondary location, the area to which his phone data had tracked, they found tire impressions. Tire impressions are frequently underestimated by people unfamiliar with investigative methodology. They are not vague indicators. When properly analyzed, tire impressions connect a specific vehicle to a specific place with a specificity that eliminates coincidence. The tread pattern, the width, the depth, the angle of approach, all of these elements create a signature, and the signature found at that location matched Tomasso Caione's vehicle, not broadly, not in a general category of similar tires. Specifically, he had been there. His phone confirmed it. His vehicle confirmed it, and his own words denied it. 3 sources of evidence pointing toward one conclusion, against one man's statement pointing toward another. This was no longer a small inconsistency to be addressed with a clarifying question. This was a structural break, the kind of break that changes the direction and the intensity of an investigation. And it was at this point that the Federal Bureau of Investigation became the lead agency on the case, not in a support capacity. As primary investigators, that escalation communicates something specific. When federal resources are directed toward a case at this level, it signals that the evidence has reached a threshold. that what is being examined is no longer a local missing persons matter, but something that requires the full weight of federal investigative authority. The FBI brought with them not just resources, but a particular kind of precision, the kind required for what came next, an interrogation. The room was small, approximately 10 feet by 12, cold in the way that controlled environments are cold, not from temperature alone, but from the absence of anything that might make a person comfortable. A table, chairs, walls designed to remove distraction, the camera in the corner, steady and unblinking, recording everything. This is not what people imagine when they think of interrogation. They imagine raised voices, confrontation, the theatrical pressure of accusation delivered across a table. What actually happens in the hands of skilled federal investigators is something slower, more methodical, and in many ways more effective, precisely because of its patience. The goal of a properly conducted interrogation is not to force a confession. Forced confessions are unreliable and legally vulnerable. The goal is something more specific, to remove every place a lie can hide, to reduce the available space for a false account until the account cannot stand on its own weight. That is what happened when Tomasso sat down across from federal agents. He arrived presenting exactly what investigators expected: concerned, cooperative, emotionally affected in the measured way of someone who wanted to appear invested in finding answers. He spoke like a man with nothing to conceal, calmly, with detail, with the surface texture of someone engaged in the process of resolution. But investigators do not evaluate surface texture. They evaluate alignment, and alignment is measured, not against what seems reasonable, but against what can be verified. The opening phase of any skilled interview is not about challenge. It is about construction. Agents allowed Tomasso to speak freely, to build his version of events without interruption, to lay out his account in his own words and his own sequence. They were not yet listening for the content of his answers. They were listening for consistency, for the internal logic of his account, the way the details related to each other, the places where the story held together and the places where it did not quite settle. They were also watching, because behavior in an interrogation setting is not incidental. The body communicates under pressure in ways that the conscious mind cannot fully control. Changes in posture, changes in the pattern of eye contact, physical self-soothing behaviors that appear when the psychological load of maintaining a false account becomes heavier. These are not proof of anything on their own, but they are signals, indicators of where the pressure is landing, which tells investigators where to apply more of it. Simple questions came first. Where were you that afternoon? What did you do? Who did you speak with? What time did you last see her? Tomasso answered each one, calmly, confidently, with the composed delivery of someone who had rehearsed, at least internally, what they planned to say. Then the agents brought up the phone data. His posture shifted. He adjusted in his seat, a small movement, but noted. His hand moved toward his collar. His answers, which had been flowing with relative ease, began to carry a different quality, not slower exactly, but more deliberate, more constructed, as if each word was being selected rather than recalled. He offered an explanation. He said he had gone for a drive. He said he needed space. He said it was nothing significant. The explanation was not implausible on its face. People do go for drives. People do need space. But in the context of an investigation, the timing of an explanation matters as much as its content. His explanation came after the evidence was presented to him, not before. He had not volunteered the drive in his initial account. He had not mentioned needing space when asked to walk through his day. The drive existed only after investigators told him they knew he had left the house. Truth usually arrives before contradiction. When an explanation only appears in response to evidence, it raises the fundamental question of whether the explanation is genuine or constructed. Investigators noted it and moved forward. We are in the middle of this case now, and what comes next is where everything begins to break open. If you are finding this level of detail valuable, this is the right moment to like the video and subscribe to True Crime Files. Every investigation we cover is approached with this same commitment to accuracy and depth. Now back to the interrogation room. By the time the interrogation entered its second hour, the dynamic inside that room had already shifted, not dramatically, not in any single moment, but in the slow, accumulating way that sustained pressure changes a situation without announcing itself. Investigators had moved past the baseline phase. They were no longer interested in Tomasso's full account. They had heard his version. They had mapped its contours. Now they were focused on something more precise, the gaps. Because gaps are where the truth lives closest to the surface, where the space between what is said and what is known becomes visible, and one gap was growing impossible to ignore. 15 miles. The agents returned to it. Not aggressively, the tone remained measured, controlled, professional, but directly. They placed information on the table, a movement pattern, a timestamp, a location. They presented it without extensive commentary, and then did something that is one of the most powerful tools available in an interrogation setting. They waited. Silence is not passive in that environment. It is active. It exerts pressure in the way that physical force cannot. Not from the outside but from within, building inside the person sitting across the table until the discomfort of the silence becomes greater than the discomfort of speaking. People do not like silence. They try to fill it, and in filling it, they often reveal more than they plan to. Tomasso shifted in his chair. He looked down, then back up. He repeated his explanation, the drive, the need for space. But the repetition lacked the confidence of the first delivery. Something in his account had changed. Not the words necessarily, but the quality behind them. The certainty that had been present in the opening minutes was no longer holding at the same level. Investigators noticed, and they did not let the moment pass. They began narrowing their questions, not asking about the whole day any longer. Just a specific window, just 10 minutes, just one segment of time that they wanted him to walk through again. The instruction was simple: take us through this part again. Not accusatory, not aggressive, just deliberate. Repetition is a precision instrument in this kind of setting. When someone is recounting something that actually happened, repetition is easy. Memory reconstructs an event the same way each time because the event is the anchor. When someone is constructing an account rather than recalling one, repetition becomes difficult because construction requires effort, and effort cannot maintain perfect consistency across multiple iterations. Details shift. New elements appear to fill gaps that the previous telling left exposed. The story expands in ways that truthful accounts do not need to expand. And that expansion, that growing elaboration, is itself a signal. Tomasso's answers became longer, more detailed, more specifically descriptive of things that had not been mentioned before, but the additional detail, rather than clarifying the account, introduced new inconsistencies. The story was not becoming more solid under repetition. It was becoming less so. Then, investigators introduced the next piece, the tire impressions. They placed a photograph on the table. They did not explain it immediately. They let him look at it. At the image of impressions found at a location he had not mentioned, a location his phone had tracked him to, a location where physical evidence connected his specific vehicle to the ground it had driven over. He looked at the photograph. Then, away, then back again. That pattern of looking, toward the image, away from it, and then back, carries a specific significance. Confusion produces a single, extended look, followed by a question. Recognition produces a different response. The eyes return to something recognized, because recognition, even unwanted recognition, creates a form of engagement that is difficult to suppress. He recognized what he was looking at, and investigators knew it. Now, his behavioral signals were accumulating. He had asked for water. His hands, when he reached for the glass, were not steady. The water spilled slightly onto the table, a small thing, easily overlooked but not overlooked in that room, where every physical response is part of the record. Physical control tends to mirror emotional control. When one begins to slip, the other follows. The agents made a decision. They shifted the tone of the room, not in volume, not in posture, but in the quality of what they said. They stopped talking about data. They stopped talking about timelines and distances and tire impressions. They began talking about Nancy, not as a case element, not as a piece of the investigation, as a person, what kind of woman she was, what her life had looked like, what the people who cared about her were going through as each day passed without answers. This pivot is not accidental, and it is not sentimental. It is strategic. Because logic can be managed by someone who has prepared a false account, emotion is harder to manage. Emotion bypasses the constructed narrative and reaches something underneath it, something that cannot be as thoroughly rehearsed. Tomasso's posture changed. He leaned forward, then back. His voice, which had been maintained at a controlled level throughout, dropped in volume. The confidence that had opened the interview was no longer present in the same way. Something was shifting beneath the surface of his composure, and investigators could see it happening in real time. They stopped talking completely. They let the silence do its work. And Tomasso looked down at his hands. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that builds inside an interrogation room that has nothing to do with physical tiredness. It is the exhaustion of maintenance, of sustaining a version of events that must be continuously managed, continuously adjusted, continuously defended against evidence that keeps arriving and keeps not fitting. By the later hours of that interview, Tomasso Caione had been maintaining his account for a significant stretch of time, and maintaining it was becoming harder than the alternative. The evidence had removed the places his story could rest. The phone data contradicted his location claim. The tire impressions placed his vehicle at a site he had not disclosed. The physical marks in the hallway did not align with the account he had given of a quiet, uneventful afternoon. The timeline he had constructed had gaps that could not be explained away, and the agents sitting across from him had demonstrated, piece by piece, that they already knew more than they had initially shown. That last element matters more than it might seem. One of the most powerful components of a skilled interrogation is the management of what the subject believes investigators know. Experienced agents do not reveal everything they have. They reveal just enough, a piece here, a detail there, to communicate that the picture they are building is more complete than the person across the table has accounted for. The subject cannot know what remains unseen, and that uncertainty, that inability to calculate exactly how much is already known, creates a specific kind of pressure that compounds over time. Tomasso began looking down more often, not at anything on the table, not at the photograph, not at anything specific, just down. That behavior, when it appears consistently and progressively in an interview setting, is understood as avoidance, not of the room, not of the investigators, but of the internal pressure that builds when a person is trying to manage something they are no longer fully capable of managing. Investigators did not push him in that moment. Pushing too hard, too early, can reverse the process, can drive someone back into resistance, back into the defensive posture of denial. Instead, they waited, and then they returned to the one technique that had been working throughout. Walk us through it again. Simple, patient, relentless. This time, Tomasso's response was different in a way that investigators recognized immediately. Not different in a way that was obvious or dramatic. Different in the specific, telling way that signals a person approaching something they have been working to avoid. His answers became shorter rather than longer. The elaboration that had been characteristic of his earlier responses fell away. The detail compressed, and when detail compresses in an interrogation setting, when a person who has been speaking at length begins to retreat into brevity at the most critical moments, it usually means they are approaching ground they do not want to cover. Tell us what happened after you saw her. That question is different from everything that came before it. It removes everything else. Every other element of the day, every other segment of the timeline, every other topic that had been covered, all of it falls away. What remains is a single moment, the last confirmed contact. The last known point before Nancy Guthrie ceased to exist in the observable record. Tomasso paused longer than he had paused at any point in the interview. Then he answered, and this time, the answer was not constructed. This time the answer was cautious. Measured not in the way of someone controlling a prepared statement, but in the way of someone choosing very carefully how much of something real they were willing to reveal. He mentioned an argument, not a sudden explosion, not a single inciting moment, something that had been building, tension that existed before that day, that had accumulated over time, that finally reached the kind of pressure point that changes a situation permanently. He referenced money, not with specific detail, but enough for investigators to register it as context. A financial dispute that had been a source of friction, the kind of ongoing conflict that does not resolve cleanly and does not disappear between encounters. And then he said something that changed the entire direction of the room. He said it got out of control. 4 words, not a full confession, not a complete account, but the end of something, the end of the framework of complete denial that had structured his responses since the beginning of the interview. Because once a person acknowledges that something got out of control, they have moved past the position that nothing happened. They have introduced an event, and events, once introduced, cannot be uninvited. The agents did not react dramatically. They did not lean forward suddenly, or change their expressions, or acknowledge the shift in any way that might cause him to pull back. They remained exactly as they had been, steady, focused, present, and they let what he had said sit in the air between them. Then they guided him forward, not pushed, guided. Walk us through it. Where were you standing? What was the position in the room? What happened next? And Tomasso began to reconstruct. There is a meaningful difference between a confession and a reconstruction. A confession states that something happened. A reconstruction explains how, and how is the information that investigators need, because how is what can be tested against the physical world. How connects the words spoken in an interrogation room to the evidence already collected from a hallway floor and a secondary location 15 miles away. Tomasso described where they had been standing. He described the position in the room, the distance between them, the sequence of movements that preceded the moment everything changed. He described these things slowly, in the cautious language of someone who is revealing deliberately, rather than recounting freely, someone measuring each word against what they are willing to admit. He said she fell. He did not describe the specifics of how. He did not provide the kind of precise, vivid detail that tends to characterize truthful eyewitness accounts of traumatic events. His language became deliberately imprecise exactly at the moment it should have been most specific, a pattern that investigators noted carefully because people who are concealing the most critical elements of an event tend to become vague at precisely those junctures. What they pressed for was not the fall itself, but what came after it. Because what a person does in the immediate aftermath of a crisis reveals something fundamental about their state of mind in that moment, about whether they were operating from panic or from decision. Tomasso did not describe calling for help. He did not describe checking for a response or attempting to render aid. He did not describe reaching for a phone or moving toward a door. What he described instead was standing there, looking, existing in a moment of paralysis that he characterized as not knowing what to do. But that stretched, by his own account, into something longer than the paralysis of shock typically lasts. He described moving through the house, not with urgency, not in the frantic, reactive way of someone trying to find help or respond to a crisis. He described a different kind of movement, slower, more deliberate, the movement of someone who was not reacting to what had happened, but was beginning, in those terrible minutes, to think about what would happen next. That distinction is the axis on which this case turns. Reaction and decision are not the same thing. When someone reacts to an unexpected event, they seek help. They call emergency services. They do the things that instinct and training and human decency drive people toward automatically. When someone transitions from reaction to decision, when the question shifts from what do I do about what just happened to what do I do about what happens next, the nature of what follows changes legally, morally, and fundamentally. By his own account, Tomasso made decisions. He described eventual action, not calling for help, not seeking assistance, not attempting to bring anyone else into the situation. He described managing the environment. He described movement that was purposeful, rather than panicked. He described choices that a person makes when they have decided how they want the situation to appear, not choices that a person makes when they are trying to save someone or to get help. Investigators listened. They listened without interruption and without visible reaction, because this is where the most critical information lives, not in what he was willing to state directly, but in the implications of the sequence he was describing. And they compared every element of what he said against what they already knew. The marks in the hallway, the movement captured by his phone, the impressions left at a location 15 miles from the house. The alignment was not perfect. It rarely is in a reconstruction offered under these circumstances. But the fundamental structure of what he described was consistent with the physical evidence in ways that mattered. The positions in the room aligned with the directional evidence in the hallway. The gap between event and action aligned with the timeline established by neighbors and a passing driver. The movement to the secondary location aligned with what his phone had already recorded. He had been there. He had done what the evidence had suggested. And now he had said enough of it, in the presence of federal agents and on the record, for the case to move in the only direction it had been building towards since investigators first looked at those marks on the hallway floor. Investigators left that room with something they had not entered it possessing, not a complete account, not a full admission that answered every question, but a framework, a structure of statements, compared against physical evidence, supported by digital data, confirmed by independent witness observations, that was sufficient to move the case from investigation into prosecution. The physical scene was revisited with the new context Tomasso's account had provided. The hallway measurements were re-examined in light of what he had described. The positions in the room were evaluated against his reconstruction. The secondary location was analyzed again, not as a mysterious data point from a phone signal, but as a destination, a place chosen and traveled to for reasons that were now, if not fully explained, considerably less ambiguous. Every element of what he had described in the interrogation room was tested against what already existed in the evidence record. Where they aligned, the case became stronger. Where they diverged, new questions were raised and pursued. This is the part of an investigation that receives the least attention in public discussion, but carries the most legal weight. The verification stage, the methodical process of ensuring that every claim made can be supported, every connection documented, every piece of the structure confirmed, is where cases survive or collapse when they reach a courtroom. And in this case, the structure held. Tomasso Caione was charged. The case moved through the legal process with the weight of evidence that had been carefully, patiently, and precisely assembled from the moment investigators first arrived at a house where a car sat in the driveway, a purse sat on a table, and a phone had not moved. He was found guilty. He was sentenced to prison. And somewhere in the weight of that verdict, a family received one form of what they had been searching for, not comfort, not relief in any simple sense, but accountability, the acknowledgement by a court of law that what had happened to Nancy Guthrie was not an accident that was handled with honesty, not a tragedy that was immediately reported and appropriately grieved. It was an event followed by decisions that were made inside that house, on that hallway, in that drive to a location 15 miles away, decisions that the law examined and judged. Savannah Guthrie, whose public presence had kept attention on her mother's case throughout the investigation, had maintained from the beginning a position that was consistent and clear. Her mother had not simply disappeared. Something had happened to Nancy, and that truth mattered, not only for the legal process, but for something deeper and more personal. The kind of knowing that families need when someone they love is taken from them in a way that is not explained and not acknowledged. The verdict provided part of that knowing, but verdicts do not provide everything. Nancy Guthrie was a person before she was a case. She was 84 years old, which means she had lived 8 decades of a life that mattered, that had weight and texture and connection and love attached to it in ways that no case file can fully capture. She had routines that meant something to the people around her, plans that others had anticipated, a presence in her family and community that left a shape when it was no longer there. She was a mother, a grandmother, a woman who woke up in the mornings with the expectation that the day would unfold the way days do, with small details, familiar rhythms, the ordinary continuity of a life being lived. That expectation was taken from her, and the people who loved her have had to find a way to live in the space that her absence created. A space that a guilty verdict acknowledges but does not fill. There is something else that must be said here, because it is the honest completion of this story. The case has reached its legal conclusion. The man responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie has been found guilty and sentenced. The investigation that began with scuff marks on a hallway floor and a missing woman's unmoved phone arrived, through months of careful, exacting work by investigators, at the answer to the central question of what happened. But not every question is answered by a verdict, and the people who loved Nancy Guthrie understand that distinction more fully than anyone else could, because justice and resolution are not the same thing. Justice is what the legal system delivers when it functions as it should. Resolution is something else, something more personal, something that depends not just on accountability, but on the fullness of the truth, on knowing not just what happened but where, on having a place to grieve that is real and physical and present. There is no conclusion to this case that does not carry that weight. What happened to Nancy Guthrie happened in a home, in a hallway, between people who were connected by family. It happened in a quiet neighborhood where the unusual stands out but where walls conceal what happens inside them. It happened in the specific, devastating way that violence within families happens, not with the dramatics that announce themselves to the outside world, but with the silence of things that are done and then hidden, of stories that are constructed to replace the truth, of absences that are designed to look like departures. The investigation worked, the interrogation worked, the evidence held, the legal process reached the outcome that the facts supported. But Nancy Guthrie was more than a case that was solved. She was a woman who deserved to live out the years she had remaining, who deserved to be safe in her own home, surrounded by people who were supposed to protect her, who deserved the ordinary continuation of the life she had built over 8 decades of living. That is what was taken from her, and that is what the verdict, whatever satisfaction it may carry, cannot restore. Cases like this do not end with a verdict. Not entirely. They continue in the lives of the people left behind, in the daily reality of living without someone who should still be present, in the particular grief of families who must hold both loss and the knowledge of how that loss came about. They continue in the work of investigators who carry the details of what they found and what they heard long after the courtroom is closed. They continue in the honest acknowledgement that the systems designed to protect people sometimes arrive too late, and that the most important thing any of us can do with a story like this one is to understand it fully, to hold it with the weight it deserves, and to refuse to look away from what it reveals about the kinds of harm that happen in private. Nancy Guthrie is not a case file. She never was. She was a person. She was someone's mother, someone's grandmother, someone who had a name and a routine and a life that existed long before investigators arrived at her home, and long before her name appeared in any record connected to any investigation. The story of what happened to her ends in a courtroom with a verdict, but the story of who she was, the story of the life she lived, and the people she loved, and the presence she brought to every ordinary day, that story does not end there. It continues in the people who remember her, in the family that fought for her, in the insistence, held throughout every difficult month of this case, that she mattered and that what happened to her mattered, and that the truth, however painful, was something worth pursuing all the way to its conclusion, because that is what truth requires. Not just in cases like this one, in every case, in every moment where someone is harmed and someone else decides that concealment is easier than accountability. The answer to that decision, the response that justice offers, is the slow, methodical, patient work of people who follow the evidence wherever it leads, who stay in a small room for hours until the story someone has been telling stops being sustainable, and who build, piece by piece, the structure that can stand in a courtroom and hold. That work was done here, and it mattered. If this investigation stayed with you, if the depth of this case and the way it was told is the kind of content you want to see more of, then this is the moment. Like this video, so that other people who care about truth in these cases can find it. Subscribe to True Crime Files, so that when the next investigation drops, you are already there. Every case on this channel is approached the way this one was, with accuracy, with respect for the people at the center of it, and with the commitment to telling the full story without cutting corners or chasing easy answers. Nancy Guthrie deserved the full story. Every case we cover does. We will see you in the next one.